Welcome back to another episode. I'm Kobe Mercury Clark. Welcome to my channel. If this is your first time visiting, I am a photographer and I do videos in regards to educating beginners to photography, and I shoot with Pentax camera gear. So a lot of my videos are focused on the Pentax brand. Anyway, this video is actually going to be for beginners to photography. I see and hear this all the time. As you just browsing on YouTube, you see it all the time. There's even books that are written and tutorials and educational series in regards to how to get out of shooting auto. Shoot manual, manual, shoot raw and manual. Now the problem with that is manual has its place, as does aperture priority, as does shutter speed priority. They all have their usage, their use cases. Manual mode is not the be-all, end-all of everything. There are situations where manual mode is just not a viable option. It's just not. If you can't control the lighting, you can't control the exposure, you can't control the environment that you're actually shooting in, manual mode may not be the best thing for you to actually dive into. If you're just getting started with your camera, I always stress learn the other modes first, because that will actually give you a better idea once you actually do learn manual mode how the different settings, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed actually correlate with each other. It's very, very easy to mess up manual mode when you're just starting in manual mode and you haven't understood aperture priority or shutter speed priority, and you're just jumping the gun and getting way ahead of yourself. So the first thing you need to do is learn what these different modes are on the dial here. So I'm going to change this over to manual mode. So I'm in M. Now, as I was saying, unless you are in control of the environment, and it could be that you're outdoors. For example, where I am right now. I'll just give you a quick spin around here. So on the one side, it's very bright, very, very bright. And on the other side, it's all in shade. Completely different exposures, right? So, seeing as they're completely different exposures, it's actually why I picked this location. The reason is, in manual mode, if you are taking a shot of, say, this greenery area, that you just saw, it's going to be dark. So you will need to adjust your exposure manually, the ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, in order to get the exposure correct for that scene. Now, the difference in brightness from, let me just spin this around again, from that to this is pretty significant. So if you were to leave these settings the way they are and you happen to see, a bird flying by or something you want to actually get a shot of, and oh wow, by the time you actually go through and change all the settings, that shot's going to be gone completely. Or if you even forget that you're in manual mode, or you don't realize it, and you take the shot, it's going to be way overexposed because you set everything up for a darker environment. Which is why most landscape photographers shoot in aperture priority, most sports shooters shoot in shutter speed priority. They dial in either the aperture or the shutter speed. So aperture priority, you dial in the aperture, the camera will change the shutter speed and the ISO for you. In shutter priority mode, you put in how fast you want the camera to fire, so you change the shutter speed, and the camera will adjust the ISO and aperture to give you a proper exposure based on your shutter speed setting. So you only have to focus on one thing at a time, and the camera will do everything else for you. Now, it is not a bad thing. A lot of people, for whatever reason, it's been preached that it's just a bad thing, having the camera do everything for you. You're not a real photographer if you don't let the camera do all this. If you let the camera take over, you're not a real photographer. Well, that's not really true. You want to look at what the most efficient way to get the end result is, and you want it to be a decent result. So I'm going to actually just spin this around here, and I will adjust my settings specifically for this darker environment. And I'm going to have to drop my aperture down. So 4.5 shutter speed, all the way to 1/80th of a second, ISO 100, actually 1/50th of a second, ISO 100. And so you can actually see what I've got here. Hopefully that'll show up, and here we go. 1/50th of a second, ISO 100, f4.5. I may change it depending. Let's just see here. Take a shot of. This is not going to be the greatest shot because I'm using a wide angle lens here. Okay. Now, with the same settings, I haven't changed anything. Now with the same settings, I'm going to just turn around here, and I'm going to. Now you notice here right away, right there. That is the exposure meter. It is way overexposed. So what does that mean? Well, let's take a shot of, let's see, there's a boat down there. So let me just take a shot of the boat. Exact same settings. And that's what you get. Completely washed out. Completely unusable. Now, if I change this over to aperture priority, so changing this dial here to aperture value, and I'm going to dial in the aperture I want, so say f8, and you'll notice it's at 1/200th of a second at ISO 100. So it's adjusted the shutter speed for me. As I continue to adjust this, you'll see the shutter speed keeps changing on its own. Right? Because the camera is going to adjust on its own in order to give you the best chance at having a good exposure. So we're going to take a shot. And that's what we get. Now, if I use the same settings over here, where I was shooting before, into the darkness, the issue with this in aperture priority mode is that the shutter speed is now at 1/25th of a second. So I don't actually want that. What I want is auto ISO, so it's at ISO 200. I'm now at 1/60th of a second. But say I wanted to slow down, like say, imagine there was a waterfall here, and I wanted to slow down the water, so I need a super slow shutter speed. I can't do that because I'm in aperture priority mode. So I can't actually change the shutter speed. So I would actually need to go here and change the dial to what we as Pentaxians have, TV. Other camera brands, it's S for shutter speed. This is time value. It's the same thing. Now I can actually adjust the shutter speed to be as low as I want, and the aperture itself is not changing. So here's the shutter speed, and you'll notice the aperture is now changing. I go into ISO, I want auto. So as I change the shutter speed, see the ISO is changing, but I cannot change anything else. The camera is changing the aperture for me on the fly, and that's how fast it can actually change it. Versus if I have to change settings in manual mode, I mean, there's shutter speed, the aperture, and then, oh wait, ISO. Okay, that looks good. Okay, I want the aperture to actually be lower. Oh wait, okay, now I need to change the ISO again, and oh, that's a little better. Oh, too dark. Got to change this down. So you see what I mean? It takes a long time to actually change all the various settings when you're in manual mode versus letting the camera take some of the headroom off of you. It's a lot more efficient, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. So manual mode, again, as I said, does have its place. Don't worry about jumping into manual mode right off the hop. Learn aperture priority, learn shutter speed priority. And speaking of shutter speed priority, so let me show you what happens if you leave it in aperture priority and actually try to shoot something with action. Okay, but can you use aperture priority to shoot subjects that are moving? Well, let's find out. So I've got my, I'm in aperture priority mode. As you can see here, right there, AV. And I am currently sitting at 1/320th of a second shutter speed. Right there. F11, ISO 200. Actually, let me bring this to F8. That's generally where I go. So just the ISO's changed a little bit. Shutter speed still remaining the same. And let's see what happens. And we just need to actually wait for a gull to come by. They are generally pretty plentiful. But it doesn't seem like that's going to happen.
All right, so here we have the first image from the aperture priority shot of the gull as it was flying along in the sky. Now, I did wait an exponentially long period of time. I didn't want to bore you guys with that, so I just figured I would grab the shots that I needed to get and come back to the studio and actually present them on the screen as you see here. So this was the first shot. Now, if we zoom in 100%, you'll notice it's blurred. It is focused, it's just blurred because the shutter speed at 1/500th of a second just was not fast enough to capture this gull. And the next shot in this sequence, same settings, ISO 100, aperture is f8, 1/500th of a second. Again, you see here that it is blurred. It's not sharp. There is some blur. And it's motion blur because, again, the shutter speed just was not fast enough. And same settings again, f8, ISO 100, 1/500th of a second. And you'll see, once again, it is not sharp. It's focused, it's just motion blurred. So then I actually moved over to shutter priority mode and cranked up the shutter speed. So I'm shooting here at 1/2500th of a second at ISO 800, and the aperture is f6.3. And look how much sharper this is. And this is a harder shot to get in focus because of the size and the proximity. So every error would be exaggerated due to how close the gull actually was to the camera. And the next shot here, same thing. It is sharp. And same settings. ISO is 640. Shutter speed's 1/2500th of a second. Aperture 6.3. So I'm even using a more open aperture for this, and it's still sharp. Next shot, again, sharp. Right? Nice and sharp. Froze the motion because I raised the shutter speed, which you cannot do in aperture priority mode because you're only able to adjust the actual aperture. And this is the final shot here of the gull. Again, 1/2500th of a second, ISO 640 at f6.3. So there you have it. One thing I did want to mention is the simple fact that when you are using manual, you do have the option of using auto ISO, which I would suggest you do that if you can't control the exact exposure environment in regards to the lighting and whatnot, or if the lighting is changing. I would actually encourage you to use auto ISO. And, you've got to kind of stop taking, the shoot manual, only manual. Like I said, it has its place, but so does shutter speed priority and so does aperture priority. They all have their place. They're all in the camera for a reason. So you should use them. As I said, landscape photographers use aperture priority, sports shooters use shutter priority, just because of the fact that the camera can change settings a lot faster than you can, and that's pretty much all there really is to it. So, once again, if you like the video, leave a like. If you haven't already, please do subscribe. And if you have any questions, comments, leave them down below. If you'd like to support the channel, I leave that information at the bottom of the description. And that's pretty much it. Ooh, see how bad that is? Oh, yeah, same settings. Look at that. Oh. So it was exposed for this. I turn around, look the other way, and bam! That's what I got. Anyway, if you want to support the channel, leave that info at the bottom of the description. That's it. Time for me to go. You'll see me on my next video. I'm out.